Fantastic. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you very much for your patience. There's a bit of a queue at the door, but we're really delighted to welcome you here tonight. My name's Emma Griffin. I'm the current head of school. I'm here at the School of History at Queen Mary, University of London. And it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome so many of you here to the school's home in Arts 2 in the heart of Mile End for this evening's event, which is a collaboration between the School of History and the Mile End Institute, which are co-sponsoring this event with us. I'm going to introduce the lecture series, and I'm going to then hand over to Peter Hennessy, who's going to introduce tonight's speaker, Simon Schama. Before we do that, though, I have been asked to point out to you where the fire exits are, up there at the back and down here at the front. We don't have any fire drill scheduled for this evening, so if the alarms do go off, please get up and leave the building. So this is the first in a new series of distinguished lectures, the Hennessy Lectures, on themes of particular importance to the work of the Mile End Institute. Over the next 18 months, we will be welcoming a range of speakers, including the first Muslim cabinet minister, Baroness Saida Wazi, the novelist, journalist and historian of empire, Santhan Samgara, and of course tonight's speaker, Simon Schama. The goal of the series is to both amplify and enhance the work of the Institute, and of course to pay tribute to our patron and founder, Peter Hennessy, Lord Hennessy of Nympsfield. Peter's career, talents and attributes really do defy simple summary, but I want to draw attention to his distinction in at least 4 different spheres. First, as a journalist and broadcaster. Peter is a former leader writer and Whitehall correspondent for The Time, and a writer for the Financial Times, The Economist, and numerous other publications. More recently, he's been a broadcaster for Radio 4. I could say more, much more, but in the interest of time, I will move on secondly to his work as an academic and a pioneer of contemporary history. Peter co-founded the Institute of Contemporary British History in 1986 and then joined Queen Mary in 1992, becoming Attlee Professor of Contemporary History. I will add that in 1992 I also arrived at Queen Mary as an undergraduate, and Peter delivered the first history lecture I ever listened to on what was our British History Survey course. I was just one of many hundreds and hundreds of Queen Mary students who have experienced firsthand his enthusiastic, inspirational and very, very generous teaching. As an academic and writer, in addition to teaching the likes of me, he's written at least 20 books, including histories of post-war Britain, the hidden wiring of the Constitution, nuclear policy and the secret state. Third, as a legislator, Peter was raised in the House of Lords in 2010, where he has spoken particularly on constitutional questions and on standards in public life. And last, but very, very far from least, I'd like to note Peter as a thoroughly humane and decent human being who has achieved an almost unparalleled feat in navigating the worlds of journalism, academia and politics without losing his kindness, generosity and sense of humour. Peter, welcome back on campus tonight. It's such a pleasure to have you here. He's going to come up now and I'm going to hand over to him to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Emma, for that very kind introduction. It's lovely to be back home. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to see you all. I hope I'm audible at the back. Being able to attend your own memorial lecture is a pleasure verging on the exquisite.
Yes, of course.
Certainly, it's very life-enhancing. On the theme of life enhancement, Simon Schama has been doing that for me since we first met in 1968. I was immediately blown away by the zest with which he pursued his history, the brio with which he expressed the results, and the spun gold of his conversation. He has too been the dearest of friends across the decades. Thank you so much, Simon, for agreeing to come. You're very welcome. Tonight, in these most sombre of times, we need his wisdom and his insight. Simon.
Thank you, dear Peter. Really, you're so kind, thanking me for showing up, and 99%, as Woody Allen said. But really, I have to thank you. It is an enormous honour that you've done me to be the inaugural speaker in the inaugural deliverer of the Hennessy lectures. Peter and I do go way back. I mean, he reminded me, as he was bound to, that we first met. It's very interesting. This does say something about our respective personalities, I think completely benign, that I sort of remembered him coming into my study at Christ, Cambridge, and he said, no, we met actually either climbing in or climbing out of Newnham College together in 68, which was almost certainly true. One of the reasons I love him for more reasons than are people in this audience and admire him. He is, as you know, an extraordinary writer. And there is this sort of strong armature to what he does. I mean, there's the Peter of very powerful prose about the civil service and the cogs and springs of government. I mean, the civil service should consider it extraordinarily fortunate that it can actually be made as entertaining a subject, actually, by someone writing like Peter. But then there is a sort of poet in him, really. I do think of him as writing as the kind of Proust of Walthamstow, really. That must have been said lots of times, I think, no? And so here he is in the introduction. I adore the works on the 1950s and 60s, on the post-war histories, which are extraordinary masterpieces. So here is Peter talking, sort of prefacing, having it so good. Like everyone else my age, I can be transported back in a moment to the 1950s by coal smoke on a damp wind. Something of an old lady, I can't read my own writing, I'm sorry, that's what happens when you get to a certain age. The sight of an old lady in a grey Packer-Mac. Yes, a snatch of Perry Como singing Magic Moments. We could, don't panic, we're not going to burst in song. On the other hand, we might, if things go badly. Or even the sight of a bottle of baby sham. So I love that. That's what I mean about the Proust of Walthamstow. So given the merriment that he and I have had over the years and shared, even in tough times, when, for instance, many years ago, West Ham was losing tragically to Manchester United at Upton Park, I suspect that he'll be surprised to hear that for Thomas Carlyle, the damning symptom that the Jews were, in Carlyle's words, a people terrible from the beginning, was that they lacked a sense of humour. Of course, Carlyle's own joke book was on the thin side, as was that of the other great wag of 19th century history and philosophy, Ernest Renan, who made the same charge. Carlyle's idea of being comical at the expense of the Jews, or Houndsditch, as he liked to call them collectively, in his latter-day pamphlets of 1850, was to parody the call of used clothes peddlers, old clue, to which he added that the Jew, old clothes, again a collective noun, having now grown fairly pestilential, a poisonous encumbrance in the path of men, burn them up with revolutionary fire as you like, and can. Even so, but you shall not quit the place until you have gathered from the ashes what gold or other enduring metal was sewed upon them or woven upon them. No wonder Hitler was an avid fan of Carlyle. But before we get completely serious, Peter, and just to clear matters up about our tribal humorlessness, it's incumbent on me to ask you, what's the difference between a Jewish pessimist and a Jewish optimist? The first time ever tongue-tied, yeah? Close. The Jewish pessimist said, "Oi, things couldn't possibly get worse." The Jewish optimist replies, "Oh, yes, they can." And so they have, which right now is no joke at all. Not when a demonstration in Sydney a day after the October 7th massacre marched to the chant of "Gas the Jews." When someone thought it a clever idea to workshop a photo of Belsen survivors, skeletons and cap stripes, so that they held placards protesting Israel's war. A photograph, by the way, taken at the very moment when entry to Palestine or anywhere else, including Britain, had been sealed off. Not when the chant goes up in Hunter College in New York, "We say no to genocide, Jews on campus, pick a side." When the police in every major British city advise Jews how they can safely dress, since any of them wearing a kippah or a Star of David are likely to be assaulted and told they're complicit in genocide. Not when the Community Security Trust reported in late February that in the month since October the 7th, there have been over 4,000 incidents of anti-Semitism, ranging from the harassment of Jewish children on their way to school and the defacing and desecration of synagogues and cemeteries. When all this is happening and the space British Jews can occupy without fear or anxiety is radically contracting, it's obvious that they find it difficult to enjoy the civil rights and protections available to anyone else in this country. This is something that would have confounded my mother and father, who grew up respectively not far from here in Whitechapel and Stepney, and who assumed for most of their life the unproblematic character of being British and Jewish. In a breathtaking swoon of false equivalence, anti-Zionists routinely characterized Jews as the new Nazis, people who were the victims of an industrially planned and executed extermination of 6 million souls are now vilified as its unconscionable perpetrators. A recent exercise, some of you may know the article, I'm not going to identify it, in academic high casuistry, made sure to lift the term industrial scale from Holocaust narratives and land it on the Israelis in Gaza. Foreign Office civil servants were giving a briefing, courtesy of King's College, by Australian academics specializing in what they've called critical terrorist studies, reducing the complex history of Zionism and Israel to a Manichaean fable of colonial oppressors and oppressed. Wearily to those of us who've spent decades researching this torturous history, none of this has come as a surprise. What has come as a surprise, though, is the refreshment of the most ancient tropes of Jew hatred to reinforce some of those demonizing simplicities. The blood libel, the medieval fable coined first in England that Jews murdered Christians, usually children, so their blood could be used to bake Passover matzah, can be read in a refreshed version in caricatures of Benjamin Netanyahu, for whom I most certainly, it's well known, hold no brief whatsoever. His bloody teeth sunk into the body of an infant, images which have become tragically commonplace in many anti-Zionist demonstrations. The blood libel has enjoyed robust life in the 20th century, from Russia to Yemen. The Arabic version was the Matzah of Zion, first published in 1986 by Mustafa Tlas, then Minister of Defense in the Assad government of Syria, and going through many editions, still in print. But its most influential enactment, I think, reenactment, was in July 1946, when an accusation of child murder triggered a pogrom in the town of Kielce in Poland, expressly directed at the tiny remnant of Holocaust survivors. 42 were killed, another 50 badly injured. The intended lesson of Kielce was what Jews could expect should they have the temerity to return to their pre-war homes, even when the gates were locked against their going anywhere else. Only one place held the prospect, not in any simple scenario whatsoever, eventually of the possibility of a new life. That's the country whose existence, not whose occupation, and all the injustices and acts of inhumanity that have flowed from that occupation, but whose very existence many commentators and the chants of street demonstrators now demand to be terminated. It's no longer sufficient, should you wish to be tolerated as a halfway decent Jew, to express compassion as many of us do, for the Palestinian civilians of an apocalyptic military onslaught and for an ending to these cycles of carnage. It is instead obligatory to repudiate the existence of Israel itself, river to sea, its 7 million Jews, and I dare say a good part of its 2 million Palestinian citizens, disposed of somewhere, somehow, wherever. This new orthodoxy has been greeted by the vast majority of Jews in this country with deep dismay. It has not gone unnoticed that the secular democratic state offered as an alternative has found models pretty much nowhere in the modern history of the modern Middle East. Hamas at least offers no such utopia. Instead, it's always been helpfully frank that what it has in mind for Palestine is a Sharia-enforced theocracy on the Iranian model. So forgive us if we reckon that the massacre and mutilating rape, the armed resistance acclaimed by the likes of Judith Butler, constitute a more realistic prediction of how that state transformation is likely to be enacted, not least because it was already rehearsed well before the creation of Israel in the rapes and massacres of the Farhud pogrom in Baghdad in the summer of 1941. But it's easier to demand the liquidation of Israel if you redefine Zionism as the ideology of a white supremacist, ethno-fascist state, rather than no more than the defense of a right to exist. But then perhaps we ought not to be surprised that of all the countries in the world, many of them shamelessly, competitively steeped in slaughter, oppression and persecution, Israel alone apparently requires elimination. How could this be? Anti-Zionism says that it is Israel itself that has created anti-Semitism. Zionism says that is the wrong way round, that it is the result, not the cause of anti-Semitism. That to engage in some sort of argument whether the Jews weaponized the Holocaust to justify a Jewish state is beside the point, since it misses the millennia of Jew hatred, the perennially catastrophic failure of diasporic toleration, which gave rise to Zionism. To engage with this history of Zionism then requires something more than slogans. It asks for a modicum of knowledge, not just of 20th century, but of 2 millennia of Jew hatred, all the way back to that beginning of which Carlyle spoke with such casually showy malevolence. In fact, to the first account of the Jews and their culture, given in the early years of the 2nd century by Tacitus. Tacitus's main concern in that volume, as you know, is with the rocky road to power of the Flavians, and subsequently their imperial campaigns. One of those campaigns, Germans aside, deals with the toughest nut to crack and was fought in Judea. In Book 5 of the Histories, prefacing the description of the war and Titus's destruction of Jerusalem, Tacitus supplies something akin to an ethnographic sketch of the social and religious practices of the Jews, owing as much, if not more, to how he and other contemporaries like Martial and Juvenal saw the Jewish diaspora in Rome itself, rather than anything he might have learned of Judaism in Judea. Tacitus's account is not that of a neutrally curious commentator in the manner, say, of Herodotus' observations about Egyptians, but for the most part a catalogue of all the characteristics instructing Romans not just to mistrust, scorn and fear the Jews, but to treat them as permanently unassimilable subverters of imperial law and religion. Underlying much of that verdict is a backhand compliment, remarkable since the Jewish population of Rome in the 1st century could have been no more than 5,000, probably a good deal less. So the backhand compliment is the anxiety about the power, despite those small numbers of the Jews, to proselytize and create a shadow population of faux Romans. Even odder is the suspicion that Jewish aniconism, the refusal to worship animal or anthropomorphic gods, or, more significantly, I suppose for him, to place statues of the emperors in their temples, their mystifying devotion to a single abstract divinity, as immaterial as nubes, as Juvenal put it, worship of the clouds, hence its elusive nebulousness. All this might exercise some sort of attraction to the suggestible. Much of this hostile suspicion about Judaism had been imported from Hellenized Greeks, especially in Alexandria, where there was a large, often physically beleaguered Jewish community. But Romans as thoughtful as Cicero, as well as Tacitus, took the threat of Jewish superstitio replacing Roman religio very seriously. Underlying the anxiety was an infuriated incredulousness that, as Seneca put it, the vanquished were giving law to the victors, that notwithstanding the utter destruction of Jerusalem and its temple carved into the arch of Titus, Jews might still prevail where ultimately it could matter most in the contest of beliefs. That apprehensiveness had specific inhumane consequences, namely the mass expulsions of 139 BCE and 19 CE. Consistency with his own suppositions is not one of Tacitus's salient characteristic, at least in these startling passages. For while he makes an immaterial, spiritually driven devotion a subversive cult, he's also at pains, like Juvenal, to emphasize the physical and carnal attributes by which they say Jews separate themselves treacherously from the Roman state and its laws. The two social markers of that separation are abstention from pork, and as Tacitus writes, the sinister and revolting custom of circumcision, which, since Egyptians had long, in fact, practiced that, Tacitus is wrong to ascribe exclusively to Jews. Those habits were not just to be considered social idiosyncrasies, but a design to distance Jews from other Romans, the loyalty of the former Jews the loyalty of Jews being reserved for Welpi, the circumcised. This ritual self-estrangement, as Tacitus saw it, was the foundation of their antisocial misanthropy, something he doesn't allege against the German tribes, whose barbarism was instead characterized as of a piece with their primeval forest home, the rituals of their unspoiled tribalism, obdurate and heroic. The obstinacy of the Jews, on the other hand, was stained by urban cunning, and thus to be more mistrusted and despised. Separation is painted into Tacitus's version of the foundation story of the Jews, but it is crucially a separation, and pun not intentional, that cuts both ways. After reporting various sources claiming the Jews to have originated in Crete or Ethiopia, Tacitus states, quote, that most authorities agree on the following account. Throughout Egypt, there arose a bodily wasting disease, which in other words seems to be, according to most scholars, leprosy in that narrative. And that the then Pharaoh was informed by an oracle that he must expel the carriers of infection. That cleansing, as it's described, duly took place, but one among the expelled, Moses, while leading the unclean into the wilderness, invented the cult which gave the contaminated their distinctive identity. The Exodus then, quite contrary to the Hebrew scripture, was not an admirable act of self-liberation from slavery, but one of pharaonic public health. The hostile foundation narrative associating the invention of Judaism with physical infection was thus sent on its long, dehumanizing, baleful history. It was part of the demonizing medieval mythology claimed that the Jews gave off a bad smell, the Fetor Judaicus. It was also a characteristic of the anti-immigrant polemics at the end of the 19th and early 20th century that characterized Eastern European Jews as carriers of typhus, tuberculosis, and diphtheria, a public health menace to the ports and cities at which they arrived, and not least, of course, by Nazis and other modern anti-Semites who depicted Jews not just as the vermin who were host to deadly infections, but as walking pathogens or parasites themselves, requiring extermination as a condition of the survival of their host societies. Tacitus's assertion the story of the expulsion from Egypt was not, as he claimed, the work of most authorities, but rather merely the most influential one. That related by the 3rd BCE century Heliopolis priest, historian Manetho, thought by Plutarch to have been the author of the first Greek language history of Egypt. That in turn, hope you're still with me, was a garbled version of an earlier account of the expulsion from Egypt, not of Jews, but of the shepherd kings, the Hyksos, said to have journeyed after their expulsion first to Syria and thence on to Judea. Yet another anonymous but kindred Greek text had turned on the instruction given to the Pharaoh Amenophis by the oracle, granting his wish to behold the gods in person only on condition he cleanse Egypt of lepers and unbelievers. The former were to be drowned, the latter banished into the desert waste. Among this second group of the unbelievers was one of their priests, the Moses-like Ozaseph, who then again went on to found a peculiar cult forbidding the worship of animal gods like Horus. But for Tacitus to have been persuaded that the expelled lepers were identical with the Jews, he would have had to have read yet another account, that of the bitterly Judeophobic grammarian Appian, another Hellenized Egyptian, who lived towards the end of the 1st century BCE and into the next. And most likely, since Tacitus also borrowed heavily from Josephus's history of the Roman war against the Jews, he would have encountered Appian's text from its rebuttal in Josephus's Against Appian, the first great post-biblical defense of the ethics of Judaism. Josephus witheringly dismissed Appian's recycling of the Manetho leper story as a work coat of clownish ignorance. But if in his scholarly way Josephus took it apart, not least for its blunders of chronology, according to Josephus, Tacitus put it back together again. So it's hard not to speculate, though it is speculation on my part, that Tacitus thought himself to be in a polemical dialogue with Josephus, the Romano-Jewish historian who wrote in Greek. Though Josephus was a generation older than Tacitus, their writing careers overlapped, but more importantly, probably for both of them, the Jew was held to be, in Josephus's only case, a social superior. This particular Jew, the protege of both Vespasian and his son and successor Titus. Josephus wrote while lodged in the family apartments of the Flavian emperors. Tacitus might not just have resented those gestures of imperial benevolence bestowed on a Jew, but considered them acquired under false pretenses. Josephus famously being a prime example of divided or even fraudulent allegiance. His career glaringly contradicting the stereotype of Jewish isolation and misanthropy. But his translation from a Judean general to an eager Roman collaborator was, in the view of skeptics, an act of cowardly expediency. Once the scion of Jerusalem high priests, Tacitus might have thought always a high priest. The most elaborately fantastic of the fables perpetrated by Appian was that of the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, discovering in the inner sanctum of the Jerusalem temple a stupefied Greek lying in a bed before a table full of dainties from the fish of the sea, beasts of the earth, and fowl of the air. Released from this gourmand captivity, the victim explains that while traveling through Judea, he'd been kidnapped by the Jews who then locked him up, and according to what he said was their religious prescription, subjected him to force feeding so that at the ritually ordained moment, properly fattened up, he'd be sacrificed in the depths of a wood, his murderers feasting on his entrails, while they swore perpetual enmity to the Greeks. Tacitus does not recycle this choice horror story, but he did represent the Jews as implacably hostile to the rest of mankind, their repellent cult rituals amounting to an inversion of everything Roman and Greek culture held to be sacred. And the archetype of a secret conclave of murdering, cannibalistic Jews feeding off their victims would have a very long life, morphing into the blood libel in which the Jews drank the blood of their crucified victims. Many of the elements of modern as well as Christian and Renaissance Judeophobia, as Peter Schaeffer, who's written brilliantly on Judeophobia in antiquity, has richly documented, were then already sketched in pagan antiquity. The Jews as a homicidal secret power, both murderers and cannibals, battening on the bodies of their hosts while carrying lethal infection to the Gentiles. As Theodor Herzl would observe, Jews from the beginning of the diaspora were attacked both for rejecting absorption into the host culture and for embedding themselves all too completely. But the deeper perennial truth inaugurated by Tacitus and his contemporary Judeophobes was, again, a quotation from Tacitus, they confront the rest of the world with a hatred reserved for enemies. David Nirenberg has argued, and I believe persuasively in his excellent book, Anti-Judaism, that the perpetuation of these dehumanizing hatreds was not a marginal element in the construction of other cultures and allegiances, from Christian to Enlightenment to modern nationalism, and some varieties of Marxism, but functionally constitutive for all of them. Jews and Judaism were framed to be the necessary differentiator, the alien around which the coherence of their opposite could be defined and affirmed. If that was true of St. Paul, true of the 4th century Bishop Gregory of Nyssa, who preached against the Jews as advocates of the devil, a Sanhedrin of demons, as he said, St. Ambrose, who characterized their religion as a sickness, and John Chrysostom of Antioch, who warned against any physical or personal contact with them, lest their Satanism infect good Christians. It would also be true of anti-Christians, like Voltaire centuries later, in the ominous engagement with Isaac de Pinto, in which the philosophe ultimately refused the Jew, even one who repudiated his religion, admission to the party of humanity for no other reason than the prohibitive disability of his race. It was true of the grandson of the Rabbi of Trier, Karl Marx, who characterized the cult of capital as quintessentially Jewish. It was true of Henry Ford, admired even more than Carlyle by Hitler, who believed that Judaism was Bolshevism with a longer beard. Fear and hatred of the Jews was, for those who expressed and promoted it, the indispensable clarifier of allegiance, whether to church, state, nation, class, or empire. Perception of Jews as free radicals, and I sort of use the word clinically, was reinforced by perceptions of them as socially shifty, geographically itinerant, and prolifically multilingual, an especial source of suspicion during the Reformation, when national vernaculars, coupled as they were at the dawn of printing with shifts in allegiance, came to contest the primacy of Latin. The Jews were thought of correctly as migrating writers, printers, and publishers, perpetually on the move, transcontinentally connected, able to cross the frontiers between the Islamic and Christian worlds, often not what they seemed or owned up to, in every way dangerous, yet somehow also needed. Economically, to perform the activities forbidden by canon law, money lending above all, of course, but also confessionally and even intellectually. As Renaissance humanists developed an interest in Jewish esoterica and mystical literature, the Kabbalistic Zohar in particular its sacred numerology, this intrigued Christians calculating the timetable of the Golden Age. So as this developed, selected rabbinical scholars became very close to Christian Hebraists, like Egidio Antonini, the Cardinal of Viterbo. Following the loss of the library of Eliyahu Levita, one such Kabbalistic scholar, among many other things, in Padua during the War of the League of Cambrai in 1509, Antonini invited the rabbi to lodge in his Roman palazzo and share his library until the sack of Rome in 57 turned both of them out. These alliances, in which not infrequently rabbinical Jews tutored Gentiles in Hebrew, fed the suspicion of Protestant reformers that the degeneracy of the Roman Church was partly attributable, as they thought, to its Judaization. In 1543, the same year that saw the publication of his On the Jews and Their Lies, Martin Luther commissioned Lucas Cranach the Younger to make an engraving of Pope Paul II, writing the Judensau, the Jews' Sal. This was the folk image carved or sculpted in German church decoration on the underside of pews, or even occasionally painted reliefs on the facades of town halls that inverted the Jewish aversion to pork by representing hook-nosed Jews feeding off the excrement of the pig, suckling its teats, drinking its urine, or all three. Cranach rose obligingly to Luther's specifications with a print showing Pope Paul riding the Judensau, his cupped palms heaped with steaming pig dung. The usefulness of the Jews in Christian and Muslim societies was always weighed against the danger they posed as hostile organisms, provisionally and conditionally admitted into the body of the faithful. Many contradictions came with this psychological balancing act. On the one hand, Christian teleology required their conversion for its consummation, of course. But on the other, suspicion lingered that many conversions were not made in good faith, or in fact, a cover for the persistence of secret Jewish practices. This, of course, was not at all altogether untrue. They were, it was said, bred and educated to deceive, so that Christians and Muslims had to be protected against the unconfined Jewish absorption into the host culture by requiring them to live in a police district, enforcing strict restrictions on their comings and goings, and by requiring them to wear visibly identifying signs on their garments, a yellow or white badge of the tablets of law, or a hat of a particular colour and shape. Most importantly, the condition of their toleration, again, both in Christian and Islamic societies, was their submission to absolute defenselessness. Along with their many social degradations, Islamic law expressly forbade Jews who were assaulted from fighting back. Any Jew in both Muslim and Christian societies, again, discovered to be carrying or storing a weapon incurred a capital sentence. Hence, it's not surprising to find that when attacks on Jewish communities arose, as they repeatedly did, they rapidly turned into exterminating massacres. Fez in 1033, Granada in 1066, York 1190, and so on. Nonetheless, there would be times when even those constraints seemed inadequate to meet the threat apparently posed by the defenseless, institutionally humiliated and civically degraded Jews. For who knew, given their money lending, what mischief they might get up to? Especially suspect were Jewish doctors. Notwithstanding the strict prohibitions against in Christian societies against Gentiles being treated by Jewish physicians, they were still very much sought after, particularly by those in the elite of Christian society, for their reputed access to esoteric drugs and remedies, many of them originated in the Arabic pharmacopoeia. Needless to say, this did not preclude attacks being made on some of them, not for occult specialized knowledge, especially of antidotes, but in North European societies for not having any medical knowledge at all, no better, it was said, than swindling mountebanks. At the other end of the social scale, it was suspected that unscrupulous Jewish physicians might abuse the personal vulnerability of their patients to administer the very poisons they were supposed to be defending against. The fact that is in the style of the most famous Jewish doctor of all, Moses Maimonides, at the Ayyubid court in Cairo, doctors were often also rabbis, masters of arcana, triggered anxieties they might exercise magically malevolent powers. When in his last year in 1546 Luther caught a cold travelling through a village populated by Jews on his way to his birthplace of Eisleben in Saxony, Luther wrote to his wife Catherine that although he wasn't himself sure, were she to be in his company, she would have certainly have blamed his illness on the Jews. And come to think of it, Luther went on, perhaps they, the Jews, were blowing hard at me. When I passed through that village, a cold draught blew into the wagon and almost froze my head, I swear. More seriously, Jewish doctors were suspected of hiring themselves out for foreign plots. The most famously sensational allegation, trial and punishment in this vein was that of Rodrigo Lopez, body physician to the aged Queen Elizabeth I. As a converted new Christian, Lopez was able to count Tudor notables like the Earl of Leicester and Walsingham among his patients, as well as fatefully Elizabeth's last favourite, the Earl of Essex. Lopez was a known supporter of the exiled claimant to the Portuguese throne after its absorption into the Spanish Empire. But this was no reason, rather the reverse, to assume he was in league with Spanish designs on the English crown. But Lopez's mistake was not so much to correspond occasionally with Spanish connections, but to gossip about treating Essex for sexual infections, a scandalous embarrassment which led the patron cum patient to turn on him and concoct an accusation that he was indeed at the heart of a Spanish conspiracy to poison the Queen. The charge laid in 1594 was expressly designed to compensate for the fiasco of Essex's botched counter-armada against the Spanish 5 years earlier. The usual torture was applied, confessions extracted, though Lopez's own was retracted as soon as he was off the rack. One kind of unmasking, that of the treacherous physician, was naturally coupled with another, that of the fraudulent Christian, notwithstanding Lopez's constant profession that his conversion had been irreversibly sincere. Convicted and sentenced to being hanged and quartered, it was reported that during his last extremity he repeated protestations of devotion to the Virgin and Saviour, and that met with noisy derision from the crowd of spectators. Edward Cook, leading the prosecution against Lopez, had already made the linkage between religious and political perfidy clear in court when he called Lopez, quote, a perjured, murdering villain and a Jewish doctor worse than Judas himself, not a new Christian. The Lopez case, and for that matter Christopher Marlowe's Jew of Malta and Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, suggests that Jews did not actually have to be present in a community for this Judeophobic effect to register with fully sinister force. There was a handful of converso Jews, probably no more than 20 families in London, in the late 16th century, some of whom were almost certainly covertly faithful indeed to their old religion. But there were none at all 200 years earlier when Chaucer had his prioress tell a tale of a small boy, yet again a child, kidnapped in the midst of singing a sacred anthem, murdered by Jews, the body thrown in a privy covered in Jewish excrement, from where miraculously, and to the consternation of the Jewish murderers, continued to sing. When the time came to consider the possibility of having Hebrews once more reside in England, discussions in Oliver Cromwell's Council of State used the issue of the Jews to promote competing visions of the Commonwealth, mercantile or millennial. Ought the Jews to be readmitted for their commercial benefits and global trading connections, or was their presence tolerable only as an overture to their eventual conversion and the hastening of the kingdom of God? Were those two purposes at odds with each other, or somehow complementary for a godly but economically ambitious nation? Beyond those Whitehall deliberations from which Cromwell himself stood back, a storm of Judeophobic agitation brewed and broke. Its lightning conductor was William Prynne, who published a tract misleadingly titled Short, Prynne was very seldom in this particular moment short demurrer to the Jews, long discontinued remitter into England. Prynne was a thorn in the side of Cromwell as he had been to the Stuarts, but he spoke with the authentic voice of demotic hatred of the Jews. At length, Prynne rehearsed yet again the choicest medieval blood libels, none of which have really disappeared from public popular memory. Little St. Hugh of Lincoln crucified and eviscerated, another Jew who commissioned a portrait of the Virgin and Child expressly so it could be thrown into the privy, and who strangled his own wife when she wiped away the filth, all the usual favourites. Over and again, Prynne repeated the divinely ordained punishment of perpetual wandering imposed on the Jews, who were, he wrote, the greatest haters, revilers, and persecutors of Christ, as well as his murderers. But to this familiar phobic litany, Prynne added something new. I suppose a faint echo of Tacitus, no idea if he knew that text, that they were in addition predisposed to sedition, as Prynne writes, both to our Lord and to all the places where they have been dispersed. And in the present, as Prynne calls it, unquiet season, their readmission would surely guarantee further division of the already fractured Commonwealth. What was in the offing, should they be readmitted, was an alien invasion. Quote again, the banishment of Christian freemen out of their native country, together with wives, children, kindred, along with God's own public ordinances at the self-same time, to call in foreign infidel Jews, the greatest enemies to Christ himself, to supply their places. What a sad and pernicious precedent, he added, it may prove to future ages. In short, to readmit the Jews would be to sell the Christian protectorate for pieces of silver. Prynne's was by no means the only tract written in this vein, but it was the most vociferously popular and arousing, and it made the Council of State pause, and Cromwell himself abandoned any kind of formal declaration of readmission, merely assuring the Dutch Jewish spokesman, Manasseh ben Israel, that should his people arrive in peace and practice their faith hidden, that peace would remain unmolested, as indeed it turned out. Unsurprisingly, Prynne's tract was reprinted a century later, in 1753, during the debates over the Jew Naturalization Bill, initially passed by Parliament, but then repealed after a similar storm of hysterical Jew hatred broke. The fantasies were now more elaborately enriched. The Jews would not only buy up the great landed estates, they would buy St. Paul's Cathedral and turn it into a synagogue. The Bodleian Library, with its collection of Hebraica, would then belong to them, and with it very likely all of Oxford University become their seminary. Most frightening of all, it was said in this literature, that after they had bought or usuriously extorted their way into the offices of state, they would inflict compulsory circumcision on all free men of Christian England. There were riots, assaults on Jews on the roadways, and most oddly, and in a fashion reminiscent of the Judenschau, violent attacks in which the Jews were forced to consume pork, raw or cooked. Francis Place wrote that, quote, when a Jew was seen on the streets, it was a signal for assault. I have seen many Jews hounded, hunted, kicked, and cuffed. Thomas Herring, the Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote that such an abominable spirit is brewing that I am expecting in a little while a massacre. That mercifully did not happen. The repeal of the Jew Bill preempted more physical assaults, but of course it would take another century before civil disabilities were fully removed. But much of the collective social neurosis revealed in the Prynne agitation and in the year of the failed Jew Bill, above all, the paranoia about an alien infectious invasion, returned in the last decade of the 19th century and the first of the 20th, when something like 150,000 Jews from Central and Eastern Europe arrived in Britain, among them my grandparents on both sides, my mother's family from Lithuania, my father's from Romania. But just as the murderous riot against Jews on the coronation day of Richard I in 1190 had spoken to the crusading vocation of the king, who in person deplored that massacre, and the readmission debate had put into question what kind of Commonwealth England was to be. The gathering fury in this later period against mass immigration put its emphasis this time not on the wealth of the Jews, but their poverty and their allegedly endemic tuberculosis, and became a rallying point for those championing the racial superiority of empire. How could the claims of that empire to constitute a superior civilization, providentially placed to rule over the decadence and or barbarism of Africa and Asia, be legitimately sustained if its metropolis was to be overrun by those habitually called scum? Rather than a land of hope and glory, the Jews would turn Britain into, sort of common quote, the dustbin, sometimes the dumping ground of Europe. Or so it was said very much out loud to the accompaniment of bands and banners and chanting here, on this very site, in particular in the Queen's Hall of the People's Palace, Mile End Road, on January the 14th, 1902. And what had been billed by the British Brothers League as a great public demonstration, as indeed by numbers repeatedly some 4,000 strong it turned out to be. Nearly all of the demonizing stereotypes, bar cannibalistic infanticide, decent of them not to go there, set running 2 millennia before, found a freshly receptive audience in the East End. Jews as the carriers of disease, Jews as misanthropic separatists, Jews as the bringers of alien disorder and subversion, this time, of course, branded as anarchist. Jews as the stealers of other men's livelihood, Jews as the organizers of nefarious secret global conclaves, Jews who were somehow too poor but also too rich, Jews by their own constitution indigestible in the body politic and social, Jews whose true allegiance, whatever their ostensible professions of loyalty and patriotism, was only to each other. Interestingly, the speakers at the mass meetings of the British Brothers League and writers who supported them and promoted them in local newspapers were careful to avoid using the word Jew, preferring the euphemism alien, when they spoke, as they did, of human refuse flooding the East End. No one, of course, was in any doubt who they had in mind, especially since the way had been prepared by popular books like Arnold White's The Modern Jew, a great favourite of the BBL, published just 3 years before. A debate, the first on immigration restriction, aired first by the Trades Union Congress in 1895, had been gathering pace and pressure in the 1890s. And notwithstanding the explosiveness of Home Rule in British politics, when mention was made of invading hordes, no one in these polemics meant the Irish. But although the audience in Queen's Hall that winter night and the membership of the League, which by their count, not necessarily reliable, rose to 40,000, was overwhelmingly working class, stirred up by notions that the Jews would indeed steal their jobs, its leadership was certainly not. The founding father, Major William Evans Gordon, had been an Indian Army officer and political intelligence officer on the northwest frontier, acutely and constantly conscious of the Russian threat, an anxiety he carried with him to the East End, swarming, as he put it, with indigent Jews from Russia, schooled in dangerous and disorderly politics, notwithstanding their flight from pogroms. The danger to empire was a drumbeat in this anti-Jewish immigrant campaign. It had been Rosebery, notwithstanding his marriage to Hannah Rothschild, who had proposed an alien restriction bill in Parliament in 1894, and his ally, the Earl of Hardwicke, another maximal imperialist, in 1898, both times failing to get those measures enacted. When the Conservative MP for Stepney, Frederick Isaacson, suddenly died that year, Evans Gordon stood for the seat as on an explicitly anti-alien platform, narrowly losing, but succeeding in the general election in the autumn of 1900. An alliance was formed with another Indian Army officer and official in the Primrose League, Howard Vincent, MP for Sheffield Central. But the core of the League's leadership were like-minded Conservative East End MPs, Walter Murray Guthrie, MP for Bow and Bromley, and the alcohol-rich duo of the distiller Thomas Dewar, MP for Tower Hamlets St George, and the brewer Spencer Charrington. It was not an accident that many of the meeting points for the crowds who made up the marches through the East End gathered at pubs like the Volunteer and the Baker's Arms. All the MPs prominent in the League had strong imperial connections. Guthrie had been on a mission to South Africa during the Boer War, reporting to Parliament on military hospitals. Dewar and Charrington, of course, were the prime exporters of whisky and beer to the armies and clubs of the Raj. Much of their animus against alien Jewish invasion, as they said, was that it would pollute the imperial race. Needless to say, with the Boer War not quite yet won, the most rousing songs played and sung at that League demonstration in Queen's Hall were Soldiers of the Queen and Rule Britannia. The fears voiced in Queen's Hall and at other meetings of the British Brothers League had echoes of Tacitus's and indeed Prynne's anxiety about Jewish subversion of Roman imperial religio. The order of the Christian Commonwealth and during the Hanoverian Jew bill debates, and indeed there was a sort of renewed sense of a threat at the end of the 19th, early 20th century of some sort of ill-defined threat to the Protestant settlement. That was 1688, 1689 were often invoked. All conveyed ominous warnings about an invasion by the back door, one not of conventional armies, but an invasion nonetheless of the indigent, the criminal, the immoral, the subversive, and especially the infectious. The word plague was commonly used in almost all the League's screeds to the East End press, in its speeches both metaphorically and metabolically. Though nothing violent happened on the night of January the 14th, 1902, the great demonstration licensed physical attacks in the weeks and months afterwards, assaults on Jews in the streets, shop window smashing, angry crowds outside synagogues. The favourite shout of a number of small riots was "Go back to Jerusalem." More significantly, the agitation of the League gave a strong tailwind to the cause of a royal commission on restricting immigration. Needless to say, Evan Gordon was among the members of the Select Committee. His speech reiterated the usual lament about foreign invaders bringing disease and crime. But when the report appeared in 1903, it demolished in impressive detail many of the myths about the immigrant Jews. They were not, it seemed, more riddled with disease than anyone else, or more prone to political disorder, much less crime. And I love this. In a supreme instance of backhand compliment, the report concluded that the foreign, i.e. Jewish prostitutes, are significantly and generally more sober than their English counterparts. Take what you can get, you know. The payoff of the commission, though, not for the first or last time, is in direct opposition, of course, to the evidence it had itself collected. Encouraged by the Prime Minister, Arthur Balfour, who saw Jewish immigration, I think cynically, as a winning political issue in an ominous political season, it recommended the stringent restrictions on immigration that became the Aliens Act of 1905, the first such legislation in British history. If the British Brothers League faded away, it was because its principal goal then had been largely accomplished in the daunting barriers prescribed in that Aliens Act, a measure reinforced in 1914, and amidst fears after the First World War that Britain again might be swamped, again the default term used over and over again, by another wave of alien refugees. Around 100,000 Jews died in Eastern Europe and the Ukraine in the pogroms of 1917 to 1920. A subject still needs its great historian, creating another mass of distressed refugees. Yet in 1919, a newly restrictive anti-immigrant act was passed, tightening the application process and abolishing any right of appeal for those denied. During the years of slumps and strikes, populist xenophobic anti-Semitism, as well as its country house upper-class captains, became absorbed into fascism, particularly Mosley's BUF. Fascism, whose ascent in Europe seemed to promise a muscular alternative to parliamentary democracy, promised a vision of intolerant, race-conscious nationalism that would have no room either for the desperately impoverished or the suspiciously moneyed Jews. With immigration sealed off, anti-Semitic agitation was largely a matter of fascist posturism, terrifying though it was, rather than pressure on government policy. That changed following the Nuremberg laws, and especially after Anschluss and Kristallnacht in 1938 gave the 500,000 Jews in Germany and Austria a terrifying, or the Reich, both of them together, vision of what the Reich had in store for them. The response of the Chamberlain government to that desperation was not significantly worse than the defensiveness of Franklin Roosevelt's administration in the United States or the Daladier government in France, but it was not much better either. In a contortion of moral logic, it was not so much the presence of anti-Semitism in official circles that shaped its chilly reluctance to admit any but very modest numbers of refugees, but rather its pretense or possibly honest conviction that to be more welcoming would be to invite British anti-Semitism on a scale not yet seen. Of course, that presupposed that out there in the cities and shires, the increasingly tragic plight of European Jews would meet not with sympathy, but indifference, if not actual hostility. Did not the mass circulation Rothermere papers famously exclaim on the front page of the Daily Mail, "Hurrah for the black shirts," and rant against oncoming regiments of dangerous dentists and professors? As Louise London and Bernard Wasserstein have documented, civil servants and politicians in the Home and Foreign Office believed that the loudly broadcast aim of the Nazi government to rid Germany of Jews was a deliberate strategy to inundate, favourite word, Britain with a population likely to cause domestic trouble. Best not to oblige them then, even if the price was the publicised glee of Joseph Goebbels. The British sympathy for the German mistreatment of Jews somehow did not extend to hospitality for their immigrants. In the end, Britain did accept some 70,000 from 1933 to 1945, significant number, but still a drop in the bucket of blood. The work of good chaps like Nicholas Winton and the whole operation of the Kindertransport must not be ungratefully discounted, but it should perhaps always be qualified by the tragic truth that most of the children would never see their parents again, and more unnervingly, that Whitehall officials and politicians predicted that this was likely to be the case even before the final solution materialized. Moreover, there's now overwhelming evidence that many of the potentially orphaned children suffered deep and persisting trauma from their family separation. Barriers went up. The condition of reception of adults as well as children was that it would not be a public charge. But that demand was made of a population pauperized by Nazi confiscations. Private Jewish agencies did their best to make up the shortfall. Barely a month after Kristallnacht, in early December, in December 1938, a cabinet meeting was convened to address, as the agenda put it, the Jewish problem. The result, of course, was the intended nothing. Mass immigration was suspected to give that opportunity to the Germans to plant a fifth column among the migrants, and there was a general sense shared by many in the Chamberlain government that it did not want its policies to be seen as influenced by the Jews. Chamberlain, who was actually in favour of loosening himself visa qualifications, made his personal feelings clear in a letter to his wife Hilda. I haven't got the letter here actually, but he said he was curious about, actually, he thought that the bad treatment by the Nazis of the Jews was due to intellectual envy. But he said, I do not myself care at all for the Jews. Worse, as the threats and then the reality of the Nazi extermination, loudly announced by Hitler and Goebbels, became known, the willingness of British officials and politicians to accept any Jews managing to escape the jaws of death shrank rather than expanded. It became commonplace to describe any such measure as a distraction from the war effort, a gift to Nazi propaganda, claiming this was a Jew-driven war. When the final solution itself became irrefutably known in the summer of 1942, gas chambers and mass executions by shooting squad, actions in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, the establishment of extermination camps, not just Auschwitz, but Sobibor, Treblinka, and Chelmno, there were dramatic expressions of parliamentary sorrow, moving too, genuinely. Anthony Eden's speech to the Commons in December 1942 articulated a solemn declaration of abhorrence shared by the Allies and was followed by a minute's silence. Goebbels characteristically commented that this lachrymose display, as he put it, revealed the English to be Jews of the Aryan race. Another backhand compliment, I guess. More to the point, the lament was not only not followed by any measures to help those escaping the occupation, only the tiny numbers of those already in neutral countries were thought to be, it was possible to assist. Express directives were sent out from the Ministry of Information to talk about the Jews as little as possible or not at all. The fiasco of the Bermuda Conference of British and American representatives in April 1943 was the ignominious culmination of this erasure of a specifically Jewish catastrophe. The J word was nowhere uttered. The only mutual Anglo-American agreement was not to give Hitler any excuse to offload European Jews and thus to gum up the Allied operation of the war. A Foreign Office memo in 1944 warned of, quote, the difficulty of disposing of considerable numbers of Jews should they be rescued. So the British position around 1943-44 was essentially terribly sorry, though everyone was. Helping the Jews or even talking loudly about their annihilation was offset by the paramount need not to alienate the Arabs of Palestine or the Britons of Britain, who it was assumed would erupt in anti-Semitic disorder should Jews appear in their midst. In actual fact, surveys of opinion, one taken in 1943, showed a strong majority of the population sympathetic to admitting Jewish refugees, but governments both during the war and afterwards assumed the opposite. Herbert Morrison, Home Secretary during the war, definitely, albeit no anti-Semite, was nonetheless adamant that Jews who had found refuge in Britain in the pre-war years should be considered temporary guests since, as he wrote, I am sure there will be trouble if all refugees do not go after the war. Even Jews who had volunteered for military service would have to leave, since allowing them to remain, this is Morrison still, would be an explosive element. Instead, they should be returned to whence they came, even if that country was Germany. And this is not Morrison, and even if they'd lost their entire family, had come to Britain as children and knew no one in Poland or Czechoslovakia. Morrison, no longer Home Secretary, as he had been in the War Cabinet, but I think he was Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster? President of the Council. It was crucial that, it was only the Hennessy lecture. Kept up this view after the Kielce pogrom and reported that Jews returning to France had been met with, kept up this view even after the Kielce pogrom and after reports came in that Jews returning to France had been met with violent resistance, this is true, in Paris in particular, when they tried to reclaim homes and properties. Although the appalling prospect of enforced repatriation of their places of their mass extermination was abandoned, there was for the 10% of Europe's Jews who had survived the Holocaust nowhere to go, especially, of course, as you know, not Palestine, sealed off by the British from Jewish immigration. The backwash from the last brutal year of the Mandate reached Britain itself, when following the Ilgun's execution of 2 British sergeants taken as hostages for the execution of Jewish terrorists, a homemade pogrom brought out on the summer bank holiday of 1947. Shops were smashed up, some burned in Birkenhead and Manchester's Cheetham Hill. There were anti-Jewish riots in Liverpool and Manchester, and desecrations from Glasgow to Plymouth, Bristol, and where my family went to live in Southend. In Eccles, an ex-NCO, John Regan, told a crowd, quote, that Hitler was right, exterminate every Jew, every man, woman and child. I'm glad to tell you all he was fined £15 for saying this. In the end, it was the United States, much to the Labour government's surprise and occasionally displeasure, which under the influence of Henry Morgenthau Jr., the Secretary of the Treasury, that softened its stance on refugee immigration, and indeed, of course, the partition of Palestine into Arab and Jewish states. But the turn against Jews anywhere lethally affected the ancient Jewish populations of the Maghreb and Middle East. 6 years before Israel was created, the Farhud pogrom of Baghdad in the summer of 1941, killed 300 Jews and wounded many more, and all but destroyed that millennia-old community. Jews in Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Yemen, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco had seen photographs of Hajj al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem in Berlin, declaring to Hitler that his enemy, his enemies were also theirs. They knew too, but for El Alamein, there was actually an SS planning team in Libya, the fate of European Jews might probably be theirs too. Unlike the Pieds Noirs of Algeria, the Dutch in Indonesia, the British India, or Kenya, these communities had nowhere to return to except the site of their ancestral home, the place that their language, religion, and history had originated and where in some form or another they continuously occupied. There was, as I suspect you know, and the Ottoman census tells us, a Jewish majority in Jerusalem at the end of the 19th century. But as they were persecuted, prosecuted, physically assaulted, all the old ghouls from millennia of Judeophobia re-emerge. The protocols of the Elders of Zion, blood liars, the Matzah of Zion, Jews as the authors of 2 world wars, just as Goebbels and Alfred Rosenberg had insisted, satanic malevolence to the rest of the world, the enslavement of the rest of the world to Jewish capital and to media moguls. The result in the Islamic world was a Nakba of at least 900,000 uprooted and brutalized Jewish refugees. The Perish Judah pogrom in Britain of the summer of 1947 was in part a response to the exit pains of empire of the post-war years, even bloodier in the Indian partitions and then the Palestinian partitions of the same year. But the baleful legacy of imperial contraction, it seems to me, is still very much with us. The discomfort of contraction was mitigated only somewhat by the mass immigration to Britain of displaced South Asian families. Now we are in a moment when cultural institutions, especially in higher education, are in the grip of the obligation to decolonize, which I'm sympathetic, but to undertake, which I'm not sympathetic to, a Manichaean differentiation between oppressors and the oppressed into the coarsely made sorting hat. And into that sorting hat is fitted the complicated agony of the history of Palestinians and Israelis. Atonement displacement has made the Jews once again the available villains, the condition of their toleration and expressed repudiation, not just of Israel's occupation, but of its right to exist. Historians, by and large, assume that the truth will most likely lie in complexity, sometimes in the irreconcilability of competing, equally valid narratives. In this case, what Amos Oz called the battle of 2 rights. But such complexities, of course, do not serve marches and demonstrations, the call and response of demonizing falsehoods that instead of debate, annihilating absolutisms get shouted on both sides. This is not good for the Jews, but it's not good for anyone else. It is especially not good for the health of a liberal, free speech democracy in an age when the internet encourages denunciation over debate. I've taken you rather too lengthily, I fear, for which I apologize, through a history in which the Jews have been subjected to singular distress. But that doesn't mean that the story doesn't have broader, more universal implications. Dreyfus' affair was a litmus test of whether the French Third Republic could be founded on just to equal justice, the Holocaust a test of whether the most extreme barbarism yet known to humanity could be defeated. So too, this moment of terrible tragedy in Gaza is a test whether the instincts and fundamental decency of good chaps will allow us to debate with moral intensity, but stop short at the requirement of mutual destruction. I'm optimistic, dear Peter, that the good chaps in all of us will prevail, but I confess I do occasionally have very dark moments. After all, and I suppose why I do, is just because a guest at the Passover Seder, which was filmed for the Story of the Jews, said, I think all too wisely, the Jewish imagination is largely paranoia confirmed by history. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Right. Normally. Thank you. Goodness, it's not the State of the Union, guys. You know, but thank you very much. Thank you for your patience.
Simon, thank you ever so much. I think that one of the things that's always distinguished you as a historian is the ability to say something that's truly thought-provoking and original and intelligent, and yet also connect to wide audiences who may come into the room with slightly less erudition than you do, and we have really, really seen that tonight. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Fran.
I'm going to wrap up this evening's event. I've got a few thanks I need to say. First of all, thank you to our wonderful security team for staying late for us tonight. Thank you to our student ambassadors. I'd like to acknowledge the support of the School of History for this event. A very big and a special thanks to Tom Chidwick and the Mile End Institute for their fantastic hosting and organising of this event. Above all, of course, I would love to thank the audience. I think we've had amazing questions and just really warm engagement. It's just been a really, really wonderful event to be part of, and that is very much down to the people in the room as well. But above all, and finally, thank you very much indeed, Simon, for a really fantastic